Okay, hello everybody and welcome again to our webinar for today. My name is Greg. If you haven't met me before, let me introduce myself. I've been an English teacher for the last 15 years. Most of that time I spent in South Korea, but I'm back here in my hometown, Hamilton in New Zealand, and I've been producing these webinars during lockdown for about 3 months now actually. So I hope wherever you're watching that you're very safe. As I mentioned, today's focus is going to be on listening. Now, so for grade subscribers, I know you're watching via the grade site. If you do have any questions at any stage, please feel free to click on the chat button and those messages will be relayed to me. So I'm going to take you across to the grade site now. With this listening test, it is a practice test. I think it's very similar to something that you might expect on test day, but it is not an authentic one from a previous test. It is practice, but we're going to practice together, and let's go across to the site. Okay, so hopefully you can see what I can see, which is the grade dashboard. We're going to go down to listening, and we're working on a test which the last webinar, listening webinar, was on, and it's this one here. So last time we did section 1, today we're going to do section 2. Section 1 is a dialogue about everyday English. Last time, if you watched it, the webinar was on a job applicant who was applying for a job in a bar. This is why it says cocktails. Today we're going to be looking at something New Zealand focused, but section 2 is similar to section 1 in the fact that it's everyday English, but for section 2 it's a monologue, right? So mono meaning one, so we're going to hear one person speaking. Just a reminder with the listening test, we're told that it's 40 minutes. This is not an exact amount of time. Most listening files, the actual listening tracks, last anywhere between 26 to 30 minutes. Then you have the extra 10 minutes after to transfer your answers from your question paper to the answer paper. That is different to the reading test, where you have to transfer your question, where you have to fill out the answer paper throughout the test. So you have the extra 10 minutes to check your spelling, transfer your answers with the listening test. So we're going to go directly to section 2. And as you should do in any IELTS test, read the questions first and try to make some quick predictions. Now, when I play the track, you're going to hear that it is about a museum guide, but we're just going to go straight ahead and have a look at some of the questions and see if we can use our grammar cues or grammar hints to try and work out what's going on here. So this is a very common question type. We have to write no more than 3 words for each answer. Now, we're given a new word, which, well, I guess it's new for many of you watching, and it says waka is the Māori term for. Now, we know that we can use 3 words, maybe 2, maybe 1. If you see a preposition such as for, we know that at least one of those words must be a noun. Now, the word term means a word for. So if you have, or if you can speak Māori, then you're going to know the meaning of waka. I'm assuming that most of you do not speak Māori. So what this means at least is that when you listen to the file, you're going to be listening really carefully for that word waka, and then trying to find out from the listening what it means. Let's have a look at question 12. Now, here is where you might actually get some hints, right? So historians believe that the Māori came to New Zealand in waka with hulls, right? So again, 3 words. Now, if you are familiar with boats, then you're going to know that boats have hulls. So now we can at least narrow down our prediction here for question 11. So we know that waka must be something related to boats or ships. Maybe it is a boat. So that's where you can also get information from other questions to help you with previous ones. So hulls, again, we have to look at the grammar we're given. Hulls is a noun, so we know that one of the words before there is likely to be an adjective. Question 13. The Gallipoli campaign took place in blank and resulted in many deaths. So again, preposition. We know following a preposition there's going to be a noun. Now, within, we have to think about what nouns precede or what nouns come after in. So it's going to be either a time or a place, most likely. If you have good general knowledge, you might be guessing Turkey, but this is just a prediction at this stage. And we have another one here. The Gallipoli campaign had a blank on New Zealand's population. Now, when you see indefinite articles a or an, this is going to give you a big hint because we know that the next sound is going to be a consonant sound. So with consonants, we're thinking about g, n, z, p, right? So all those consonant sounds, one of those will be following the first word will start with a consonant. As for the prediction, we don't have a lot of time. So in the actual test, you might only have a minute or so. So I'm taking much longer just to help you understand how to make predictions. Now we're on to some multiple choice ones. On test day, you're most likely to be given 4 choices. This practice test only has 3. So where were prefabricated houses shipped from? So we know that this listening is going to be about New Zealand. We can see that there at the top. So my guess would be Britain and Australia, because those 2 countries are strongly connected or closely connected to New Zealand. Again, that's just my general knowledge trying to help me with the question. How big were most colonial houses? So here, we might not know. But what we do know is that we're going to listen very carefully for that keyword colonial houses. Colonial is not a very commonly spoken word. It's a more low frequency word. So that's the word that I would be listening for when the listening starts. Whoops, I didn't mean to click that. So 17, what did most early settlers probably think about their life in New Zealand? Now you might want to make an educated guess, which means you're imagining based on sort of what you would expect. So you're guessing based on what you would expect the best answer to be. So I'm hoping that the answer is going to be C. It was better than their old lives. We tend to think that people that came to New Zealand came here to try and have better lives. So that's my guess. Again, I'm going to check that. In terms of the listening, I'm going to listen out for the keyword settlers. There may be a synonym for settlers, which you have to think about when you're listening. So synonyms for settlers may be something like immigrants or pioneers, perhaps. So I'm just going to go through all of these questions. There's 10 of them. How many points are there on the Australian flag? Well, I know this one because many people confuse the New Zealand flag with the Australian flag. If you don't know, well then obviously we're going to be listening for the word stars, flag, Australian, and there's going to be a number. So, and we're given the same question about the New Zealand flag. You could also start predicting, thinking that maybe these 2 pieces of information will be given quite closely together. So if you have time to think that far ahead, then please do. I've never come across an IELTS test where the information in the listening track is not in the same order as the questions. So hopefully this means we're going to hear some information about the number of stars on the Australian flag. And then maybe closely after, we're going to hear about how many stars there are on the New Zealand flag. Then finally, the Australian flag has an extra star. And if you're not sure what the Union Jack is, that's the name for the British flag, which is featured on both the New Zealand and the Australian flag. That's why there's often confusion. So you might actually want to try and use your general knowledge at home and see if you can image or imagine, get an image of your head of the Australian flag. Where is that extra star? Is it beneath the Union Jack? Is it beside it, or is it above it? So this is the type of question where I think it's entirely possible for you to know the answer through your own knowledge without even listening. So there's often a question or two on the test where you can, you might just know the answer, which is good. So the test itself, or the listening section itself, is usually broken into two parts. I've just done the predictions for all of them, just as a review of how to do good predictions. When we listen, you're going to hear that gap where the announcer will sort of say, you now have another 30 seconds, or you now have some more time to read questions. In this case, I think it's going to be questions 16 to 20. So that's all, maybe 15 to 20. That's how it usually works. Usually we have one question type for the first part and another question type for the second part. So I'm going to go back up to question 11, and I'm just going to go through and solve the questions, and I will explain the answers as I find them. Hopefully I can get them all right.
Section 2. You will hear a presenter giving information about a tourist destination. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15.
Okay, so here's the announcer telling us that we have some time to look at questions 11 to 15. Maybe 11 to 15. So the 4 no more than 3 words questions. This is a good indication of how much actual time you would have to read in the test. So let's see how long we might have.
As you listen to the first part of the talk, and
so obviously not a lot of time to do the reading in the test. This is why, as you're finishing one section or the section before, you need to start reading ahead to the next section. Making the predictions on this test is really the key to scoring well, I believe. So obviously I've taken a lot more time to go through the predictions, but that's for your benefit, so you can see some different ways or some different strategies for making predictions.
Out of the talk, answer questions 11 to 15. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the museum. I am your guide, Kevin, and it is my pleasure to show you around. This tour will take about an hour, and during that time, I will introduce you to the history and culture of this beautiful part of New Zealand. Now, the first thing you have all noticed is the rather large wooden canoe.
Okay, now in terms of the accents you're likely to hear on test day in an IELTS test, the main one that I've come across is British. You often hear a lot of North American speakers. In this case, this sounds like an Australian accent to me. The Australian accent is quite common. Sometimes you might even get a New Zealand accent, but I think American, British and Australian are the most common ones. Now, I'm just going to go back a little bit here.
You have all noticed is the rather large wooden canoe.
Now, as you can see from the prediction before, historians believe that the Māori came to New Zealand in waka with blank hulls, right? So that's where I thought, well, hulls are related to boats, and I just heard the word canoe, right? So it's probably not enough to confirm our answer, but straight away I'm thinking that could be the answer. So what I'm hoping for is that we're going to get confirmation that waka is the Māori term for canoe. So let's look and check to make sure that canoe is the answer.
This is known as a waka from the...
Okay, so as the guide from the museum said, the canoe is known as a waka, or maybe the pronunciation was a little off there, but that's all right. It's a hard language. So waka is the Māori term for canoe. So there we had it, right? So we found a word which was related to boats, and then the guide, the museum guide, confirmed that waka is the Māori term for canoe. So hopefully we're going to find out the blank here. Again, we know it's an adjective, and here is a little hint. Always remember that numbers are adjectives, so there might be a number involved here as well.
Maori language. This particular waka is a replica of a Maori war canoe. Historians believe the waka that the ancient Maori may have used to voyage to New Zealand from across the Pacific probably had two hulls.
Okay, so there we have it. So I'm going to read back exactly what the museum guide said, because as is the case in the authentic tests, often the questions are paraphrased from what you're actually listening to. So historians believe that the waka was the that was the ancient Māori. Sorry, historians believe the waka was what the ancient Māori may have used to voyage to New Zealand from across the Pacific, and it probably had two hulls, right? So now I've mentioned this in previous webinars, but if you have a number, always write it as a numeral, right? So I know that you're very unlikely to do this and spell two as the adverb to, but it could happen. But if you're definitely trying to answer with a number, just write it as a numeral. Then you can't be wrong. You can't misspell a numeral. So that's what I would suggest. If you're actually writing academically, then you would write it TWO. You would write it out in the alphabet. But for the purposes of this test, we want to minimize the chance of spelling mistakes, because you will be marked wrong if you spell it incorrectly. So the Gallipoli campaign, obviously we're going to listen out for the word Gallipoli, which is actually a place. So hopefully we're going to hear that soon. And then we're going to find out maybe where it happened, where the campaign took place, or when, right? So because we know from the preposition in.
This Wakatoa, or war canoe, obviously has a single hull. It is 35 meters in length and can seat 80 paddlers. This particular waka is also wide enough so that paddlers could rotate. Like many waka, this one is made from the native Totora tree. These war canoes were often carved with great detail. They were also highly sacred due to their role in warfare. Okay, next on the left is the tribute to the Anzacs. This is the Australia-New Zealand Army Corps, who fought in the First World War and the Second World War.
Okay, so if you're familiar with military history, we've just heard a reference to the First World War and the Second World War. If you weren't sure what a campaign means, it's actually related to warfare. A campaign just means like a place where a battle or part of the war happens for a long time. So it sounds like we're getting close to our answer, because there has been a reference to the First World War and the Second World War. Hopefully we're going to hear more about the Gallipoli campaign in a second.
When the First World War broke out in 1914, New Zealand was automatically on the side of the British Empire. The legend of the Anzacs was created during the Gallipoli campaign.
Okay, so there we have it. There's our keyword, the Gallipoli campaign. I'll just backtrack for a second for you so you can hear that again.
The Gallipoli campaign in modern Turkey.
Okay, I'll replay that just so you can hear the whole thing.
1914. New Zealand was automatically on the side of the British Empire. The legend of the Anzacs was created during the Gallipoli campaign in modern Turkey.
Okay, so there's our answer. Where did the Gallipoli campaign take place? In modern Turkey. Now, again, if you have a good general knowledge of the First World War, you may have already known that, or you may have predicted that, and then you can confirm it more easily because it's part of your knowledge. So we know again that there must at least be a noun in this blank. There may be 1, 2, or 3 words, but we know that the next word for the answer is going to begin with a consonant sound. Let's see if we can find the answer here.
Where the Aussies and the Kiwis fought alongside troops from Great Britain and Ireland, France, India, and Newfoundland. The campaign was a disaster. It lasted for 8 months and resulted in the loss of around 87,000 Ottoman soldiers and 44,000 Allied soldiers. 2,721 of the Allied soldiers who died were Kiwi soldiers, but due to New Zealand's low population at the time, it had a lasting impact on the country.
Okay, now this is something, this type of question is more difficult because what's happened is one of the keywords population is actually given to us before the answer, right? So you may have been expecting to get the answer before you hear the word population. If you're wondering what the answer is, it's lasting impact. And I'm going to repeat back what was said. Now, this is definitely one of the harder questions when the answer is in a different order to what is written on the question paper. So what we're told here is, okay, so 2,721 of the Allied soldiers who died were Kiwi soldiers, but due to New Zealand's low population at the time, so there's that keyword population. So, but then our answer is going to follow. It had a lasting impact on the country, right? So if you found that one difficult, that's understandable because when the information is in a different order in the listening to what it is on the question paper, that definitely makes it more difficult. Now, my suggestion, when you are moving on to the multiple choice questions, don't just, if you can't see me hiding the screen, so I would just focus on the question. Try not to have all the options in your mind at the same time. But we're just going to let the rest of this play through and we're going to move on to the multiple choice questions soon.
On April 25th every year, the sacrifice of all soldiers in the Gallipoli campaign is remembered. If you are still in New Zealand on this day, I thoroughly suggest that you attend a dawn service.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 15 to 20.
Okay, so as I mentioned, here we have the announcer who's dividing this listening track into two parts. On test day, you get a little bit more time to read ahead. We've already made the predictions for questions 15 to 20. They're all multiple choice questions. As I mentioned before, a really good tactic to just simplify this is to try and take the options out of the equation if it's possible. Just focus on the actual question. The question here is, where were prefabricated houses shipped from, right? So what will happen if you try to remember all the options as you're listening at the same time, you're just sort of cluttering your mind, in my opinion. So I would be listening out for the keyword prefabricated. There are not too many synonyms for prefabricated. So hopefully we're going to hear that word. And then we're going to find out where they were shipped from. We've already made a prediction that it's likely to be Britain and Australia. So perhaps we can hold that one thought in our mind.
Now listen and answer questions 15 to 20.
Okay, next is our collection of colonial antiques. These will give you an idea about the kind of lives that the first European settlers to the country lived. The rooms that these items are displayed in are also indicative of the size of early colonial houses. Some of the earlier houses were prefabricated wooden houses that were shipped from Britain and Australia.
Okay, so I hope you were able to identify the keyword prefabricated, and then hopefully you could follow that they were shipped from Britain and Australia, right? So the reason I think it's a good idea to not focus on all the options is because this is another common thing that you're going to come across in IELTS. We have two words which sound very similar, or the names of two countries which sound very similar, Australia and Austria. That's a classic technique used in listening tests where it's really focusing on the candidate's ability to distinguish sounds and syllables. So Australia, Austria, right? So The answer is definitely Britain and Australia, and hopefully you didn't get confused between Australia and Austria. So how big were most colonial houses, or most New Zealand colonial houses?
And assembled on site. Anyhow, most earlier homes were small by today's standards.
Okay, hopefully you could identify the paraphrasing there, where the guide tells us that most earlier homes were small by today's standards, right? So the synonym for modern is today's standards. So there's our answer, small compared to modern houses. And what did most early settlers probably think about their life in New Zealand? So I hope the answer is C, because I'm from New Zealand. So let's have a listen.
This was compounded by the fact that most families from these early times were quite large. Space was a premium, but many of the early settlers in New Zealand had come from crowded places in Britain.
Okay, so we just heard that Britain was, many of the settlers came from crowded places in Britain. Most people don't usually like crowded places. So
they probably enjoyed the wide open spaces outside.
The settlers probably enjoyed, right? So it's a positive, enjoyed the wide open spaces outside. So already I'm thinking the answer is C.
Food was also cheap and plentiful.
Okay, New Zealanders love cheap and plentiful food, like most of us.
So while life for these settlers was hard, it was often preferable to life in their homelands.
Okay, so they preferred it, right? So better, preferred. So there's our answer. Our prediction was correct. We've got 3 more questions. Now, any questions which deal with numbers tend to be easier. So hopefully you can identify the answers to these questions. You're going to be listening for the keyword Australian flag, and then how many points are there on the stars?
On the right-hand side is the New Zealand flag.
Okay, so hopefully your ears are pricking up because we just heard the keyword flag.
Now, a lot of visitors ask me about the differences between the New Zealand flag and the Australian flag. So I will explain before one of you asks me. Both flags feature the Union Jack in the top left-hand corner.
Okay, now I know for question 20, there's a mention of Union Jack. Again, I've kind of mentioned, I have mentioned that the answers every test I've come across, the answers are given in the same order as the questions themselves. So I would try to avoid skipping straight ahead to question 20 because we haven't heard anything about stars and Union Jack.
And both flags have blue backgrounds, so there are no differences there. The first difference lies in the stars. The Southern Cross.
So here, he's talking about the differences in the stars. And we know that because he said differences in the stars, we know that the answers are likely to be different. So what I mean is because he said there are differences in the stars, it seems unlikely that both stars have the same number of points
on each flag. The Australian stars are 7-pointed stars.
The Australian stars are 7-pointed stars, right? So different way of representing that number. Again, we're told that the Australian stars are 7-pointed stars. So there's our answer. And because the guide has already told us that there is a difference, that the stars are different, so it seems unlikely that B is going to be the answer for how many stars there are on the New Zealand flag. So it seems more likely that the answer is going to be 5 or 9 because the guide is telling us about the differences.
While the stars on the New Zealand flag are 5-pointed stars.
Okay, so there we have
also,
it. So New Zealand has 5-pointed stars. So hopefully this is a learning opportunity for viewers to work out the differences between the New Zealand and the Australian flag. And let's go to the last one, and we're going to find out where is the extra star on the Australian flag.
Australian flag has an additional 7-pointed star beneath its Union Jack.
Okay, So
There were
we're told finally that the Australian flag has an extra star beneath the Union Jack. Now, what I would suggest on test day, once you have that final answer, I would even just start thinking about trying to read ahead to the next section. If you feel confident that you've answered it, in this case I do, like there's no further questions, I would probably on test day go ahead and start reading, making some predictions for section 3. That's what I meant when I mentioned earlier in this webinar. So you have to make the best use of your time to give you as much time as possible to make predictions. Now, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and see how many of these questions I got right. And if I go to finish, so I've only done the one section, and yes, they've all come up as green. So, okay, so I hope this has helped you. We've done 6 different webinars together now. So remember, the webinars that we have done for listening, the 6 listening webinars, have all been from the grade practice tests, but similar to the type of content you might get on test day, and definitely the skills which we have practice, the skills which are going to help you on test day. Make those predictions, listen for keywords, think about synonyms, things like that. So I want to take you back to the digital whiteboard and talk about our upcoming schedule. So I'll just clear this. And just let you know as a reminder, we're going to go straight through to next Tuesday, which unbelievably is June the 30th. And this webinar will be for, what is it? Ah, yes, here it is. It's another listening one. Now, this webinar is a public webinar, so please feel free to join. And as always, you can ask me questions during the recording of the webinar. And for you grade subscribers again, it'll be next Thursday. Sorry about the change in schedule this week. So it'll be July the 2nd, and we're going to look at speaking. And it'll be part 3, right? So the 2 previous speaking webinars, in those webinars, we've covered part 1 and part 2. We're going to look at the 3rd part of the speaking test, and you're going to see another interview scenario like we did for part 1. So wherever you are, I hope that you're safe, and I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday for the public webinar and for another grade subscribers webinar on July the 2nd, next Thursday. Take care.